This is Jim Bob, and you're listening to the Pantheon Podcast Network.
Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 7, Episode 13 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. I don't know why I was so angry doing those hand gestures. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre. If you don't want to see this lovely shirt, which is for sale in my store, it's called Disco Time, I think, or something like that. Several styles and colors for that. And everyone, as always, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band Rec, and everything I do. Of course, our sponsor is Qobuz. It's a music streaming service that has about the same amount of songs as Spotify and Apple. Costs about the same per month, but it is all high-res audio files, and it has amazing other features that I urge you to check out. And please take a moment, pause this in a second to like, share, subscribe, follow, rate, whatever it is you do on whatever platform you're on. All of those things make a big difference to creators like me. Let's get right to the topic this week. It is a supporter-chosen topic. Amelia Ray over at Patreon requested that I do this, and it is Culture Club, Bringing the Color. And that's color spelled O-U, of course, because they're British. So why this topic? Yes, Amelia Ray. Yes, also I was a Culture Club fan. And as always, when I do topics like this, it gives me an opportunity to catch up on bands that I lost touch with and discover things that they did after their big period, etc., etc. She requested, Amelia, that I do the album Color by Numbers, again with an OU, and dive into that. Now, as you may know on this podcast, what I usually do when I choose an artist is I just go through their whole thing. I do a history. And I'll tell you right now what I'm doing: a history, a discography, and conclusions, and the featured song, and the bonus MxTRA, which I'll talk about in a second, and all of that stuff, and questions for you. And I am going to do all of that this time, but I'm also going to spend extra time on Color by Numbers because Amelia is a Patreon supporter, and Patreon supporters get extra special attention. And I wanted to do right by her. So Culture Club, yes, I was a fan. I don't think I realized how significant they were at the time. Maybe I did. It's really hard to remember, but that's something that I will discuss as we go through here. Sources are Wikipedia and laphil.com, PHIL. That's the Los Angeles Philharmonic, I believe, website. There was a great kind of bio on there, which I believe was supplied by Culture Club themselves. Disclaimers: I'm not going to do as deep a dive into Boy George's solo career because there are many, many albums, and it just would take too long, especially since I'm spending extra time on Color by Numbers. He's released about a dozen albums so far, and the most recent of those actually postdates Culture Club's most recent album, and you'll hear all about that. I also am not going to go deep into his drug use or abuse or legal problems or things like that because, as always, Music is Not a Genre is about the music. All right? And that's it. Let's just get right into this. So the history of Culture Club: they formed in 1981 in London. George O'Dowd, known as Boy George, sang for just a bit with the band Bow Wow Wow, which was kind of cool. I didn't know that. After that, bassist Mikey Craig started a band called Sex Gang Children and asked George to join that. And they were soon followed by drummer John Moss, who drummed with The Damned and Adam and the Ants, and guitarist Roy Hay. And they were soon decided that's not the name they wanted. They gave the name, in a sense, to another band, which I think released one album, and adopted Culture Club as their name. Why the name? They realized that they had a real mix of people. They had, and this is in their words, really, from their bio, an Irish cross-dressing gay lead singer. Though originally in that period he stated he was bisexual, which in and of itself was a pretty bold thing to do in the 80s, but later then did correct that and say, no, I'm gay. I believe in the 90s. I think we wrote a book. Either way, was openly so from the beginning at a time when that was very rare. They had a Black Brighton, Mikey Craig, a Jewish and not openly gay drummer John Moss, or not at the time anyway. One of Boy George's secret lovers, actually, was the drummer John Moss, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And an ethnic Englishman, whatever they mean by that, Roy Hay. So that kind of mix of people gave them the idea that they were a culture club. That's so the name came from that mix. Pretty cool origin story there. They're one of those bands that has retained its original members throughout their recording career. John Moss is currently not touring with them. I don't know what will happen if they decide to record a 7th album. We'll see if the new drummer does it or if John Moss comes back. I don't really know what's going on there. But they kept their core 4 members throughout their entire recording career and almost their entire career period, though with 2 large breaks, and you'll hear about those later. Their first 2 albums were increasing successes and would garner them tons of praise and fans and money and awards and all of that stuff. Pressure from this and George's breakup with Moss would drive George to get into drugs. And I say that only because their next 2 albums saw a steady decline in sales. That was probably part of the pressure. A decline in charting, a decline in critical acclaim, though each one would land at least one top 40 hit in the U.S. and, as always, with the world and music, many more in the UK. Between those albums, George was one of the prominently featured soloists on Do They Know It's Christmas, the Band-Aid song. By 1986, George was a serious addict, and that, plus the breakup, plus the decline of the band, caused them to call it quits for the first time. George immediately jumped into a solo career, releasing his first album in 1987. A little bit more on this later. They tried to reunite in 89, no deal. Following 6 Boy George solo albums in the 80s and 90s, they finally reunited in 1998 and released an album in 99. Of course, we'll talk about that too. That reunion included tours and lasted on and off for about 5 years. By 2003, George had a successful DJ career, an acclaimed solo album, at least in, the UK and Europe, I believe, and a West End Broadway musical, Taboo. Don't know if you remember that musical. Mikey Craig and John Moss tried to reform the band in 2006 with a new singer, but the singer sucked and the tour never happened. They did some quickie concerts in 2011 without Moss because he had a back injury, but Culture Club reformed properly in 2014, and since then have never officially broken up. In fact, I believe they're still on tour, or doing highlight shows or spotlight shows. Their proposed album Tribes in 2014 was shelved. They did more tours and then finally used some of that material, and I assume new material, for a new album called Life in 2018, which we will get to. That one is credited to Boy George and Culture Club, which would remain their official name for any other releases post that, singles and such. Note that all 6 of their albums, again, as I said, had all 4 original members. That is a rare thing. I mean, U2, right? John Moss left the band in 2021 and was replaced by Meryl Ann Evanson on drums. So an even more eclectic lineup. And they continue to tour with 3 of their 4 original members. That's the history. Let's go straight into the first album. Their first album, Kissing to Be Clever, was released in 1982. It reached number 14 in the United States and number 5 in the UK. And right off the bat, a real mix of styles, which gave them a real signature sound. They had lots of kind of island Latin influence in there. They mixed it with electronic or synths, blue-eyed soul and funk, dance for sure, rock, even a bit of country. Ska and reggae was a big thing. If you know, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? You know that. And of course, pop. Everything they did was more or less pop. But also, and that mix and also, I will say, very recognizably early 80s new wave, new romantic, which is what they call new wave in the UK. A dry production value, unlike the mid to late 80s when things were wash and reverb. And that's one of the reasons why, again, and as I've said, 78 to 82-ish, 83 is one of my favorite production periods for music. Also a time when synth and live instruments were often side by side. For example, horns, they had both fake horns and real horns. Strings, they had real strings, they had synth strings. George described their music as creatively fluid, which is a perfect description to me and kind of pushes them into the amalgam territory. So a band I maybe should have mentioned in that episode. And also just that idea that it connects with the fluidity of the band members and all of that stuff. For some reason, this cover of this, Kissing to Be Clever, is the cover I remember the best from any of their albums. And it's definitely when I jumped on board as far as liking their music. Although you'll find out the one that really sold me on them was a non-album single, which I didn't know until I did the research. Overall, a very good album and a great opening statement, but the singles are much stronger than the other album tracks, I would say, on this album. Going down the track listing, White Boy Dance Mix was their first single. I like it. You know I'm not crazy. I don't know why I remember this song, but I do. Maybe I had a copy of this album at some point. I can't find it, so I don't know if I did or not. Like that song as well. I'll Tumble For You was the fifth single from this album, but actually released after the next album's first single, likely due to wanting to capitalize on their rising success. Love that song. One of my favorite songs of theirs. Take Control. Love Twist featuring Captain Crucial. Those are fine. Side 2, Boy, Boy, I'm the Boy, I'm Afraid of Me remix was the second single. Number 9 in the US, was not released in the UK. It got to number 9, though. White Boys Can't Control It, another fave of mine from this album. And of course, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me is one of my top 2 or 3 faves from this album. It was their third single, but it was also their first single to chart in the United States. First single to chart anywhere. It went number 1 in the UK and number 2 in the US. And their non-album single, Time, oh, give me time. Time Clock of the Heart went to number 3 in the UK and number 2 in the US the same year, and it was their fourth single. This is the song that really knocked me back. I mean, I love Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, and I'll Tumble For You came after this, and I enjoyed that too. But this one, man, Time Clock of the Heart, I would actually love to cover this at some point. Color by Numbers. Now we're here. So taking a pause for reverence, because I do plan to spend a little extra time on this. It was released in 1983. It went to number 1 in the UK, so their first number 1 in the UK album-wise, and number 2 in the US. Still very early 80s sounding. I mean, 83, still in the pocket there. 80s hadn't blown up the way they would a little later, soon after. The songwriting even stronger. And of course, this is a smash, this album, and it's their most acclaimed album, and for good reason. It's the same mix of music as that first album, but more cohesive. And even adds in some jazz and a slightly harder rock sound. So getting even more eclectic, but still more cohesive. That's hard to do. It's incredible all around, and it's probably my favorite album of theirs, let's be honest. And that doesn't always happen. With some of these artists, I tend to discover, for example, with Duran Duran, Medazzaland was like my favorite album. Nobody knows that album here in the States. But and so like later albums that are less well-known. But in this case, their most well-known album, also my favorite album. This was in the days when there was rarely a sophomore slump. We talk about the sophomore slump all the time. That second album, the first one out of the gate, everybody loves it, and the second one doesn't do as well. And that's because back then there was something called freaking artist development. And so an artist's first album was considered more than anything testing the waters. It was often even self-released, developing them, trying to find their sound, trying to find their groove and their stride, hit their stride. And bands were given a chance to get stronger. And if their second album hit, then they would go on to more things. And if it didn't, they, label probably dropped them or whatever happened. Sometimes not. Think of Duran Duran, their first album, followed by Rio, Smash second album. Duran Duran didn't hit as hard here, especially here. And I think even in the UK. Think of Wham's Fantastic. Didn't even know that existed till I did that episode on them, followed by Make It Big, which they did on the second album. Think of the Eurythmics in the Garden. I don't remember that. I haven't done a Eurythmics episode. Followed by Sweet Dreams Are Made of This, huge sophomore album. So those are some examples of the non-sophomore slump. This album, Color by Numbers, would catapult them, and it won the 1984 Grammy for Best New Artist. George, in his acceptance speech, said, "Thank you, America. You've got taste. Thank you, America. You've got taste, style, and you know a good drag queen when you see one." I doubt it sounded anything like Boy George, but I wanted to do a British accent. This is often on many best of lists, Color by Numbers. The songs on the album are almost all attributed to the band as a whole, except the first two singles were also attributed, including keyboardist Phil Pickett, not an official member of the band, but somebody they wrote with and recorded with, and I think toured with. Though George and Hay would go on to write songs for other artists as well, continuing their success, including the Beach Boys. Their comeback album, I believe, had some songs from them on it. Backup singer Helen Terry, who I'll talk about a little later, and several songs for the sci-fi rom-com Electric Dreams, which I think starred Virginia Madsen, I want to say, including the title track. I don't remember any of that. Personnel on this album was produced by Steve Levine, maybe Levine because he's British, I don't know, who produced their first three albums, among other artists. Boy George on lead and backup vocals. That's it. Roy Hay on guitars, piano, electric sitar, and backup vocals. Mikey Craig on bass and backup vocals. And John Moss on drums and backup vocals. All the members sang. All the members sing. They're still around. Additional musicians on this album. As I said, I'm taking a deeper dive here. Judd Lander on harmonica is prominent on many songs. Think Church of the Poison Mind is the one that comes to mind first, the harmonica solo riff. Also, he played also on the Spice Girls' Say You'll Be There. He was a founding member of the Mersey beat band The Hideaways, who followed the Beatles in the mid-'60s and played the Cavern Club even more than they did. They reformed in 2009, and the Hideaways are still active. The aforementioned Phil Pickett on Hammond organ and synths was founder of the hit glam rock band Sailor, and has written for many other artists. Steve Granger on sax. Patrick Seymour on flute, was mostly with the Eurythmics and did work with so many others. Graham Broad on percussion, did tons of session work for tons of stars. Freaking Jermaine Stewart was on this album doing backup vocals. If you don't know Jermaine Stewart, he was on Miss Me Blind, first of all, great song, one of my faves on this album. But his big hit in 1986, "We don't have to take our clothes off to have a good time." Oh, no, something, I don't remember the rest. He actually died in 1987 of an AIDS-related disease. But great song. Didn't know he was on this album. Terry Bailey on trumpet, and the amazing Helen Terry on backups, who herself had a top 40 solo hit in 1984, Love Lies Lost. Don't remember it. My memory of that song lies lost. A huge part of Culture Club's sound in the early years. Again, I go to Church of the Poison Mind. When you hear the answer vocal to Boy George's singing of that chorus, it's Helen Terry. And if you know the song, it's burned into your brain. First opening track, Karma Chameleon, the second single, and one of the two songs most people will name when they think of Culture Club. They either name Karma Chameleon or Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, I would think. It was the first and only U.S. number one, and number one in the U.K. as well, and in a total of 20 countries. According to Boy George, it's about fear of alienation, fear of standing up for something, about trying to make nice with everyone, and if you do all that, you're a chameleon, and you pay for it. You pay for not being yourself through karma. but it was originally called Cameo Chameleon. And I get this. As a songwriter, you write the lyrics out, and then when you go to sing them, you might elide some of the syllables or change them to make the notes sound better. It often ends up changing the words. And honestly, I think 10 times out of 10, those words end up being better for the song. Number 2, It's a Miracle. That's a great song. 5th single from the album, went number 4 in the UK, number 13 in the US. The melody was inspired by a Gilbert O'Sullivan song. If you remember Gilbert O'Sullivan, I hardly do, but he had an early 70s hit, Alone Again, Naturally. It reached number 13 in the US, number 4 in the UK. I love this song, It's a Miracle. It was originally called It's America. Again, eliding those, changing it very, very close. It was because they first visited the States. That's what, but I think he realized that wouldn't have been a good lyric. Black Money's number 3, not a fave of mine. Changing Every Day, really like that song. Number 5 is That's the Way, I'm Only Trying to Help You. It's the first of 2 piano ballads. Incredible backup vocals by Helen Terry that are almost at the level of a duet. Such a good song. Number 6, Church of the Poison Mind. Was their first single and went to number 2 in the UK and number 10 in the US. I freaking love this song. It was inspired by Stevie Wonder's Uptight, Everything's All Right, and you can hear it right out of the gate in both the rhythm and the chord changes. In fact, I'd say you could mash them up quite effectively, and I say that because the bonus MxTRA for this week's episode at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is exactly that. I did a mashup of Church of the Poison Mind and Stevie Wonder's Uptight. And right now, this ranks as one of my top favorite Culture Club songs. So go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to hear this bonus MxTRA mashup of Church of the Poison Mind and Uptight. Number 7, Miss Me Blind, is probably right up there, the top. Maybe my favorite song currently of theirs is their 4th single, not released in the UK, but it went to number 5 in the US. And it was their 6th and final consecutive US top 10. Also reached number 5 on the US Soul and R&B chart, which is not easy to do. The lyric includes the title of the first album, Kissing to Be Clever. Again, one of my faves, a sweet mix of styles that I really vibe with. The guitar is almost hard, but there's funk and jazz and Latin and pop. They're just amazing. Mr. Man, another song I like from this album, was actually released as a 6th single, though it didn't chart. Actually sounds like a rock-steady late 70s Chicago, if you can imagine that. If you don't know rock-steady, it's the tempo between ska and reggae. Think of Madness did rock-steady and stuff like that. So many others, and No Doubt. Late 70s, yeah. So late 70s Chicago was after Terry Kath died, but before David Foster took them over. And for some reason, this song reminds me of that in a rock-steady way. And the final song on this album, Victims, 3rd single, not released in the UK. It went to not released in the US. It went to number 3 in the UK. It's another piano ballad, and this one was supposedly about John Moss. Not a fave of mine, but interesting. I like the confessional lyrics, and I'll get more into how that relates to me later on in this episode. B-sides are actually, some of these are actually killer. So Manshake was on the 7-inch, the B-side 7-inch Church of the Poison Mind, wonderfully sparse and featuring Helen Terry very prominently. Mystery Boy was on the 12-inch of Church of the Poison Mind, very cool post-disco. Check it out. You can find it anywhere. Melting Pot Live on the 12-inch of It's a Miracle. It's fine. Color by Numbers, the title track, didn't even end up on the album. It was a B-side of Miss Me Blind and Victims. Very nice new wave ballad. Romance Revisited was the 7-inch. Was on Victims as well. Nice piano and orchestra instrumental. It was an instrumental. They did a couple of those. Love Twist Live was 7-inch on It's a Miracle with the B-side. And That's the Way, I'm Only Trying to Help You. Wait a minute. I think I mentioned that before. So that's not technically a non-album track. Correct. That's actually on the track, but that ended up being the B-side of Karma Chameleon. Continuing on. So, Amelia, I hope that was a nice, strong dive into Color by Numbers. And as I said, that is my favorite album of theirs, and I assume of yours. 3rd album, Waking Up with the House on Fire, released in 1984, went to number 2 in the UK and number 26 in the US. So even though still amazing, you can start to see this slight decline. It was more of a piece with the previous albums, right? It was kind of right down the middle with funk, pop, electro, and a bit of Latin island. When lots of other 80s music was getting bigger and tinnier in 84, this one kind of kept it contained and warm. Maybe one of the reasons why it didn't do as well. They weren't following the trend, which is totally fine. It's a consistent album, and it's probably underrated and apparently good enough to have gone number 2, number 26, though definitely not as strong as the previous albums. It feels like, to me, a bit of a retread, like they were in need of a music influence infusion, which would come. First track on the album, Dangerous Man, really liked the production on that. Number 2, The War Song, also like that. It's the first single from the album, number 2 in the UK, number 17 in the US. And I remember this song. War is stupid and people are stupid. War is stupid and people are stupid, or something like that. Shouldn't work. Should be cheesy, but it does work. Third track, Unfortunate Thing, Fourth, Crime Time. It's one of 2 rock throwback songs, which is a popular thing to do back then, and I took it in extremely small doses. And I don't take this one. Number 5, Mistake. Number 3 was the third single. Ballad went to number 33 in the US. Number 6, The Dive. Number 7, The Metal Song. MEDAL. It's the second single. Very islandy, and number 32 in the UK, by the way. None of these are my faves. And Don't Talk About It was number 8. Mannequin. Second throwback shuffle beat song. And number 10, the last one, Hello Goodbye, not the Beatles song, another one I like from this album. It's the most mid-80s sounding song. And honestly, I think this album could have used more of this kind of energy on it. And it should have been a single. It has a scorching metal solo, and it's a very, very good song. And if you think of Dangerous Man, The War Song, and Hello Goodbye are the ones I like from this album, you got to hear those first 2, but I got to say Hello Goodbye is the standout. Non-album singles they released in the following year, in 1985, Love is Love from the movie Electric Dreams did not chart, but it's a very nice ballad. Don't Go Down That Street didn't chart as well, but really interesting song, if not great, but something interesting about it. And maybe a second, third listen, I might find it more interesting. And I feel like this is a good time to take a mid-roll break, so we will get to the 4th, 5th, 6th albums and beyond after this short break. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdematteo.com. That's Nick, DEMATTEO.com. And everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/music is not a genre if you really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. Okay, we are back from the mid-roll, and what a weird thing that happened. There was like some kind of short here, and my light went out. So I'm actually re-recording this second half. I only got a couple minutes into it, so I'm sure you're relieved about that. But it was a perfect break because those first 3 albums were really of a piece with each other. Same producer, same vibe, kind of going for the same thing. But this 4th album, From Luxury to Heartache in 1986, they used a different producer. It was their attempt to reinvent themselves. It went to number 10 in the UK and number 32 in the US, so it did well. But again, in those days, and really almost any day, if an album does well for any human band, let's say if one of us got that high, but didn't do as well as the one before it, it's considered a failure, which to me is utterly ridiculous. This album, From Luxury to Heartache, was very, very mid-'80s. It's the first time they really embraced that new 80s sound, and it definitely breathed new life into them. Honestly, prefer this to the previous album, and I prefer it a little bit to their first album. This is probably my second favorite album of theirs, maybe, behind, of course, Color by Numbers. So first track, Move Away. First single, I like it. Nice step forward. It went to number 7 in the UK and number 12 in the US, so very successful. It was also their final top 40 hit in the United States. I Pray, like this song too. Big step forward. Like Hello Goodbye from the previous album. Very, very good song. Might be my favorite on this album. Work On Me Baby, another shuffle beat song. Gusto Blusto is the third single. Did not chart. Very cool R&B rock mix. I enjoyed this song. Heaven's Children, almost a throwback new wave song at this point in the 80s, and I really, really like it. I'm glad that this is on the album. God Thank You Woman is the second single, went to number 31 in the UK. It's kind of R&B pop, and it's... number 7 is Reasons. Number 8, another favorite of mine from this album, Too Bad. Nice textures and lyrics here. Number 9, Come Clean. Number 10, Sexuality. This almost has an Art of Noise production, and in fact, I had to look up the names of this. I think it's Arif something. Did they work on, and no, they didn't work with Art of Noise, but they were clearly influenced by them. I really like the production on Sexuality, and if you don't know Art of Noise, look them up, and then listen to Sexuality from this album. After that album, they took a big break. And during that, and I mentioned that break in the history, I don't necessarily need to go over it again, but, you know, declining sales, etc., Boy George's personal struggles. I'm going to drink loudly. All right. That was for you people only listening. So, Boy George released these albums during Culture Club's break. Break up. Really, it was a break up. The album sold in 1987, which went to number 29 in the UK. Not bad for a solo album, and number 145 in the US, which is why I don't remember it. The single is a cover of the Bread song, that is a band, Everything I Own. It went to number 1 in the UK, and 3 other songs charted in the top 40 in the UK. So still doing well in the UK. US didn't care about them for another few years. Tense Nervous Headache was his 1988 album. It was released only in Europe and did not do well, but charted a few songs in kind of the top 70 in the UK. Boyfriend, 1989, not great UK singles, but Don't Take My Mind on a Trip scored number 5 US Hot R&B Hip Hop and number 26 US Dance. I don't remember this song. And it's very New Jack swing, and it's a fairly fun song. I kind of like it. 1990 released an album called The Martyr Mantras, actually credited to the band Jesus Loves You. 2 singles that charted well in the UK. Nice dance music. Balearic, if you don't know Balearic, look it up, meets Acid House. I liked the song Generations of Love so much that I have added it to my 2025 playlist. By the way, this Jesus Loves You, there are some religious lyrics on here, and there were religious lyrics that end up popping up in Boy George's music later on. I didn't honestly look up whether or not Boy George turned to religion or not. I liken it to what happened with Little Richard, who was gay, who was struggling with being gay, who got super religious, and then broke out of that and said, no, I am who I am, which is a wonderful thing. When you use religion as a way to suppress yourself or others, that is not a very good use of religion, period. I don't know how else to say that. It just is not the way. I'm not a religious person per se, but if you're going to be religious, don't do that, to yourself or others. I don't think Boy George does that, but I don't really know where this Jesus connection is for him. Look it up. Tell me. In 1992, Boy George released a non-album single, the title track to the movie The Crying Game, which was his final hit single in the US. It went to number 15. It went to number 22 in the UK, and is the last contemporaneous song I remember from anything having to do with Boy George or Culture Club until I did all of my re-listening for research for this. And it's a great song, amazing song. I believe in that same year, I want to say, or it might have been the year before, the Violent Femmes released an album called Why Do Birds Sing? And on that album, there was a cover of Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, which they did a damn good job with. You should look that up, the Violent Femmes version of Do You Really Want to Hurt Me. In 1995, Boy George released an album called Cheapness and Beauty. It went to number 44 in the UK, and it's a nice comeback for him. He did a cover of Iggy Pop and David Bowie's Fun Time, which made it to number 45 in the UK. And then in 1998, one of my favorite titles of anything ever, The Unrecoupable One-Man Bandit, Volume 1. There hasn't been a Volume 2. And the reason I like this title is because this is the struggle artists go through all the time. So he was trying to make a go of it as a one-man band, bandit, whatever, solo artist, and was apparently finding through releases that the money that was being put into him wasn't being earned, I assume. I don't know how that affected his relationship with the record company, but it usually is not good. So that's kind of a funny title. This was only released in demo form because fans wanted it. It was shelved in 1996 and finally released to the fans in 1998, which brings me to the fifth Culture Club album. They reformed, as I mentioned in the history, and released an album called Don't Mind If I Do in 1999. Now, it was released only in Europe and Japan, I'm sure for financial reasons. And it was not only their return, it was the return of producer Steve Levine, among others. This is always, to me, when chronographies, look it up, it's an MxG word, get interesting. It's the stuff that no one remembers from eras of artists that original fans never cared about, but that reveal very good music. I remember this from Duran Duran. Now, the hardcore fans in UK who stuck with Duran Duran through all these years would tell me, of course, but the US fans don't think I know they knew that their mid-late 90s material existed, after that Wedding album that they did in the early 90s, and I found it amazingly good. This album, also very, very good. I would say my second or third favorite album of theirs, to be honest. Probably my third favorite. It has a smoky, intimate, reggae-heavy sound. There's a nice sound update, but still connected to their roots. George's voice is a little more seasoned, but still incredible. Again, it's not an earth-shattering album, but I really do like it. Opening track, Just Wanna Be Loved, Magic Man Remix, was their first single and went to number 4 in the UK. It's kind of a nice reggae, not a fave. Cold Shoulder was their third single from this album, went to number 43 in the UK, and you will hear me mention that because none of these charted in the US. Great production, smoky, cool, one of my faves in the album. Maybe I'm a Fool's More Reggae. Number 4, Sign Language. Like this song a lot. Great sound, cinematic. It's sort of like a cousin to Never Met a Girl Like You Before. Edwin Collins? I don't know, I remember the name. But anyway, sort of like that. Like the song. Number 5, Mirror. Funky in sort of a second-tier Chicago kind of way. And I know Chicago well enough to be able to say that. Really love the horns in this song. Black Comedy is like a dub version of Copacabana. Interesting enough to listen to, definitely, but not my fave. Your Kisses Are Charity, Blouse and Skirt Mix, is the second single, went to number 25 in the UK. So they did well. More reggae-ish. Not a fave of mine, though. Neither is Weep for the Child. See-Through, number 9, funky, cool, and really like it. Strange Voodoo is almost like Sade, and it's an okay song. Truth Behind Her Smile is an acoustic song. It's okay. Fat Cat, it's sort of like Elton John mixed with 90s Phil Collins, acoustic with piano with some electronic, and thus not a fave of mine. Confidence Trick, moody electro, great production, not a fave song. They did a cover of David Bowie's Starman, which was also their B-side of their first single, and number 14 on this album. Very cool, funky update, almost a remix, frankly, and good enough that it was the second song from Boy George / Culture Club that I added to my 2025 playlist. Starman, look it up. And their 15th song on the album, Less Than Perfect, is as the title suggests. Then they took another big break in around 0203, as I mentioned, and Boy George released these solo albums during that period while he was DJing. You Can Never Be Too Straight, spelled the letter B and number 2, in 2002. Acoustic versions of songs from the musical Taboo, along with some new songs and redos of some old solo songs. And then 2004 released the album Yum Yum. Don't know much about this, but it is a freaking gem. It is not available on streaming. Got to find it on YouTube. It was apparently released under the pseudonym The Twin. Heavy, heavy electro, likely influenced by his successful DJ career. Insanely good production, weird effects on the voice. I would put a bunch of these on a playlist if they were available on streaming. Find these songs: Electro Hetero, Here Come the Girls. Human Racing is honestly the rockingest thing Boy George has ever been a part of, Culture Club or not. This album needs a proper release. Yum Yum, 2004, will blow you away. And I would say if I were including Boy George solo albums, this would rank as my second fave behind Color by Numbers. Absolutely. It's kind of like Bob Mold's from Husker Du's forays into house and techno, because he's also a successful DJ, but odder, weirder, and good for that. Then released the album Ordinary Alien, The Kinky Roland Files, which is a pseudonym, I believe, in 2010. And it was a collection of other stuff he did 2001, 2009 that I think was less, actually, the single Yes We Can samples an Obama speech, so that would have been one of the newer songs in the album. It's a very dance-oriented album. I don't think it was released in the usual places or just didn't chart. Don't really know. And then released another solo album, This Is What I Do, in 2013. And this is his first truly full-length album that was carefully put together since the mid-90s, although I will disagree with that, because I think that Yum Yum might qualify there too. The difference is he was newly sober. So this is very not dance. This is more like a mix of the Culture Club sound, but with lots of mid-tempo rock added to it, which a lot of people were doing then, and a lot of comeback people tend to do for some reason. It's a bit heavy-handed for me, which can happen for people who first become sober. It's the first time you can hear a change in his voice. It turns out he had a polyp shortly before this, and so it's a not as bright of a voice, but still very strong. And then they got back together and released one more album called Life in 2018. Their the second reunion album, exactly. Credited, though, to Boy George and Culture Club. As I mentioned before, his new smoky voice, very nice. It's like a mix of the 1999 album and the last 1980s album. Maybe the third 1980s album, let's say. Overall, solid, and solid production and solid performances. And again, all four original members, but it's missing the energy, which could be because I still associate them with that kind of brighter 80s sound, and this has a warm production sound that to me is nice, but it doesn't suit them as well. God and Love's first on the album, fourth single. Don't like it. Bad Blood, very nice, and the only song I actually truly like on this album. Look up Bad Blood from the album Life. Human Zoo, Let Somebody Love You, second single, reggae, fairly decent. What Does Sorry Mean? Runaway Train was their fifth single featuring Gladys Knight. Early 70s, funky and decent. Resting Bitch Face, nice title. Number 8, Different Man. Number 9, Oil and Water. Number 10, More Than Silence. It was the first single. Released 4 years before the album was released. Honestly, could have come off his 2013 solo album, and I don't necessarily say that as a compliment. And then the title track, Life, is the last track, third single. And by the way, none of these singles charted anywhere. So following this last album, they released a lot of singles credited to Culture Club and other artists, and sometimes Boy George, and they're all very dance-oriented. You can understand why. Frankly, these singles are very cool and more interesting than anything on their last album, and then a lot of the stuff on their album before that. And you can find them on streaming. I think there's like 16 singles or something. Most of the most recent was released last year in 2024, so Culture Club's still releasing material. George himself has released 2 more albums since then. This Is What I Dub, Volume 1 in 2020, which I assume is the This Is What I Do But Done Dancey. You know, I didn't listen to it. And Cool Karaoke Volume 1 in 2021, not necessarily as the title would suggest, which makes it a cool title, honestly. And again, very electro and fairly cool, honestly. Like, I like the direction that he's going in. And again, over 15 singles Boy George has released. Most recently, 2 singles in 2024. One for the movie Argyle, and another one with Andy Bell from Erasure and RSF called That Night in Brazil. They're fine. They're very good. I like the production. The songwriting is just not as strong as so much of the other stuff. And as I said, Boy George and Culture Club continue to tour as a band to this day. Brings me to the end of their discography and a cough for all of those of you who like it raw. Conclusions. They were of their time, for sure, in the 80s. Production values, especially kind of new wave, blue-eyed soul. The androgyny was very of its time. Light commenting on social issues, not too heavy commenting, of its time. But the persona was more complex than that, commenting, also of its time. Kind of like Duran Duran and Depeche Mode, let's say. But they were also ahead of their time. Multicultural, though many bands from the Second British Invasion were multicultural. They evolved their fashion and look more rapidly than most bands. When you look at the cover of their third album compared to their first, you will understand why. But of course, one of the reasons they were ahead of their time was their more or less out singer out in the 80s. I mean, even George Michael wasn't out in the 80s. He said he was bisexual, then, retracted that and said he was gay, but never in the closet and never trying to pass for straight, which was a bold thing to do back then. A lot of guys, whether it was, hair metal or some of these new wave bands, were, dressing in a very, let's say, traditionally feminine way, but were not gay. And they were, some were doing it as allies and some were doing it to co-opt, to be frank. And you can kind of see which is which fairly easily, especially if you know the history of these bands. But Boy George, to dress like this, there were artists who were gay in the 80s who didn't dress like this. To have that package, very ahead of its time. I often use Culture Club as an example of out artists in pop music being around a lot longer than younger generations think. So I tell my kids. And certainly there were before that too. Boy George and Culture Club proved you could be both earnest and fun in their heyday, that you could be both sincere and silly. And though the silly and fun aspects seem to disappear later on and or be subsumed into the dance music, which is fun, but rarely silly. And so I miss that in their later work. Although something may be lost in translation when they do these live, they're more fun. They went through a lot of styles, but never drastically changed their sound. Even with that update in the late 80s or 86, and then again in 99 and 2018, I wouldn't call it a drastic sound change. Some things were more muted than others and brought out more than others, but an amalgam for sure. Other than the incorporation of more DJ-ish elements because of Boy George's side career, that was a big change, and a nice change, to be honest. Which, by the way, again, speaking of DJ-ish, to remind you, the bonus MxTRA on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is my mashup, my DJ mashup of Church of the Poison Mind and Stevie Wonder's Uptight in homage to Boy George's DJ career. Like many bands that went through big breaks and professional struggles, they didn't necessarily bring forward all the fire and innovation they had at the beginning. Some bands do, some bands don't. Duran Duran, I think, has to the large degree. But they persevere and do a decent job modernizing their sound while staying true to themselves. I'm a fan of theirs. I love any band that mixes multiple things, and I love horns, and they use a lot, but they're not a heart artist for me. I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan of all of their stuff. That said, they did influence me, whether I know it or not. Anytime I do a certain kind of blue-eyed soul, I kind of sound like Boy George as an American, primarily because our range and the tone of our voices is very similar. Which brings me to the featured song, which is not a blue-eyed soul song, believe it or not. I'm going with a song from Rek's album Sympathy for the Weird called Scroll Out for 2 reasons. One, it has personal lyrics done with a playful twist, which is something that Culture Club did a lot of. And 2, it has a sound that mixes acoustic, laid-back rock, pop with a quirky keyboard, and a bit of a quirky beat. Not reggae, but quirky, that would fit in well with some of Culture Club's music, even though you're not going to say it sounds like Culture Club, and that's fine. That's not the point of this. The lyrics of Scroll Out, the first line that I do repeat is, I want to die a little every day. And that's mainly saying, when you die, your life flashes in front of your eyes, right? Why wait for that? Why not embrace and relive those moments now while you're still alive? If you could just capture some of that dying a little bit every day, to have the life scroll out in front of your face to remind you what the good things are, you can appreciate it while you're still here, and it may prompt you to make changes you wouldn't have made otherwise. That's the song. Questions for you. Were you a Culture Club fan? Do you feel their cultural significance is as important as their musical significance? I'd like to know the answers to these questions and any other questions and any comments you have, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me for this patron-suggested topic. Thank you, Amelia Ray, and I will talk to you next week.
Take the pain away from me. I said, don't take the pain away from me. If suffering was always meant to be a way not to forget how to be free. It's the form that gives us freedom. It's the pain that gives us joy. It's the weak that gives strength for a boy to love a boy or a girl, and a girl to love a girl or a boy. If you are one of those who can't believe that only true connectors will achieve the uplift in a life that's filled with grief, then baby, take your cardboard box and leave. Cardboard box, cardboard box. To die a little every day, a little more, so I can watch my life scroll out before my face. Oh, oh, remember all the reasons why I stay. Better why to get out of this place. Gotta get out of this place. I gotta get out of this place.